Right. So now let's look at how to write the chapter 2 of your dissertation. Right. So the chapter 2 consists of your literature review. Right. So what is this literature? Literature is already published existing knowledge that you can find out from different journal articles or books or maybe websites, which are already published and by different other scholars who have been able to find this knowledge by undertaking research studies, right? So in your chapter 2, what are the main items that you have to include? So like I said, every chapter needs to have a chapter introduction. So even in this literature review chapter, you need to have a chapter introduction of 100 to 150 words where you can highlight what this be chapter will consist of, right? So basically you can say as the second chapter of the dissertation, this chapter will be reviewing literature relevant to these themes or areas that are important and relevant to your study. And then you have to have the literature that you have reviewed, and then finally the chapter summary, right? So we will focus on the discussion of literature, which is all about your literature. So here now you might wonder what are the uh, main things that you can include in your literature as literature, right? So it depends on your topic, where you can find different themes or different concepts, theories that are specifically relevant to your study and have a literature review for those key themes that you have identified, right? So let me show you my example. So my study was basically on mindful consumption practices of consumer activists in Sri Lanka. So this is how I wrote my literature review chapter. So here you need not to have a full stop, okay? Because headings, we don't use a full stop. And then this has to be chapter introduction, right? So like I said, this chapter is consisting of what? So here, this chapter reviews the literature relevant to mindful consumption in order to solve the problem that has been identified, right? So you can always give a look back to your research question or your problem as well, because this is an entirely new chapter again. So you can have that fall forward from chapter 1 to chapter 2 and then highlight what this chapter specifically will include. So here it says it is creating a very good foundation for overconsumption and its influences, and then on mindful consumption, and then spirituality and universal love. Right. So now, like I said, now what are the areas and how you can end up identifying the topics, these topics or these themes that you are going to include in your literature review? It depends, like I said, it depends on the on your problem and your topic. So what you can do is you can go through different articles that you have found out and closely review them and find what are the main themes or areas that they have talked about, and then you can get an understanding and have those themes as your headings or subheadings for your literature review. So depending on the nature of my topic, I have talked about the environment, right? The nature around us, what is its current situation, and what are the dangers that it's facing, and so on. And then another heading was materialism, because overconsumption is driven by materialism, right? And then I have reviewed literature relevant to materialism, see. And then it was about consumption. So my study was mainly focusing on mindful consumption. However, I have to give a brief explanation about what consumption is all about and then what overconsumption is all about, right? Because overconsumption is also a type of consumption which is unsustainable. So you have both sustainable and unsustainable consumption, which I have specifically highlighted under consumption. And then I have flown into reviewing literature on overconsumption, right? And then sustainable consumption. And then only I have elaborated more on mindful consumption. So likewise, and then it's going on to universal love and spirituality. And also about consumer activists, because I used consumer activists in order to find these practices. So based on your topic, you have to determine those headings which you're going to include in your literature review, right? So my duty here is to explain you how to write or review literature relevant to these themes or headings that you have selected. So one of the mistakes that I have noticed throughout is that what students do is they just basically get an article and copy paste some of the literature parts, and then they use a paraphrasing tool, or they really do paraphrase. But it is actually a summary or an exact same thing from that particular article, but it is not the way how to write a literature review properly, right? You have to have a systematic way of writing. So you have to identify the strengths and weaknesses of these different articles, and depending on their findings, right? And then you have to explain why and how these findings influence your problem or your topic as well. So you have to, like I said, if you have two papers that you have selected, you can highlight that this article has found out these findings. But on the other hand, these other scholars, according to this other article conducted by these researchers, it says something otherwise, or it could be something of similar nature, right? So you have to have that comparison and the contrast among different studies that are relevant to your topic, right? And you can also talk about the methods that they have used and their findings and how it influences your study, right? And you can use them to justify your problem or your gap as well that you're trying to investigate in your particular study. So like I said, your literature review has to be systematic and critical, right? Don't just summarize whatever the articles that you are referring to, but evaluate, right? So like I said, what are the findings that they have found and what they have not found? And what are the other findings that are relevant to this particular article's findings, and so on. Like I said, whether it's a quantitative or a qualitative research method, and whether these findings are consistent with your study, and whether they are different, right, from another recent article. And you can also highlight different limitations or the theories that these studies have used as well. And yeah, so a tip is to actually use phrases like although, and however, and in contrast, and similarly, likewise, right? So if one article is agreeing with another article, you can say similarly, these set of scholars have also agreed on this particular finding, right? And in the literature review, you can also talk about the theories that you are going to use, right? Let's say now in my example, there was no theory. So it was only the main concepts, as in spirituality, mindful consumption, and universal love. But for your studies, you might have a particular theory that guides your topic. So you can talk about the theories as well, how they have evolved over time, and who are the researchers who have found out it, and how it has evolved over time, and who has contributed over time, and so on, right? And then you can also have you can include facts from literature to justify your research gap again and again, right? So like I said, in this particular article, these are the findings. However, it suggests that future research can do better or something like that. And then you can further justify your gap that you have identified in your literature review. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're writing, always have that connection to your study, right? And then you can also highlight the inconsistencies among different studies over time. So if you're, let's say you're talking about a particular theory and how it has evolved. Now, if I take as an example, leadership has been evolving over time, right? And you can highlight the different types of leadership theories that has evolved over time, like starting from maybe humanistic leadership styles to transformative to transitional to servant to now spiritual leadership. So likewise, you can talk about these different theories and how they have evolved and who has contributed to those studies, to those theories as well. And so one of the example is like I mentioned, several studies have explored this, but limited research has conducted on in terms of the developing countries, specifically in Sri Lanka. And if you're focusing on a particular industry, you can have a justification for it. So always you have to have that link to your gap throughout your literature review chapter, right? So in this chapter summary, you can have again 100 to 200 words where you can summarize all the findings that you have been able to find out from your literature review. And then you can have a link how your literature is supporting your research questions and objectives as well. Because if you remember, I clearly mentioned that your research questions are actually the guiding light throughout your study. So you can always link the literature that you have found in connection to your research questions and your objectives. And then you can further justify the need to undertake your particular study, because if literature or if the existing knowledge already has an answer for your research problem, there is no point of undertaking your study, right? So that is why you have to always show that there is a must or there is a need or a gap in terms of undertaking your study. And to prove that, you can bring out different literature from different sources of literature and justify it throughout your literature review chapter. So be mindful of how to use the references properly in when you're writing the literature, because this is a chapter of completely written on other people's work, right? So you have to give the necessary recognition for the authors, which is about referencing, proper referencing, and you have to have lots and lots of references to show that you have done a real good job, that you have done a systematic literature review, right? So in terms of selecting the articles, you can either go for recent articles or like, now let's say there is a particular theory which has been introduced in a very early period of time, but it is something that is a must to be spoken of in your literature reviews chapter. So include it. And then you can show how it has evolved and how it has been, how this theory has been contributed over time, and what is the most recent finding attached to it. And then, like I think I said, you can talk about the different methodologies that they have used, right? So even though you're doing a qualitative study, your article might be of a quantitative nature. So be mindful of that as well. So that is how you actually write a proper literature review, and I hope it was helpful.